So, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, I would love to welcome you to this lightning talk session after this fabulous start of the Future of Science conference and the, I think, very interesting keynotes. I'm very delighted to welcome you now to our first lightning talk session. We will speak about goals and target groups of science communication. My name is Nico Dannenberger and I work for Wissenschaft and Dialog. And for the next 75 minutes, I'll be your moderator and guide you to all of the interesting talks and presentations. On my virtual right, you see Josephine from Alea, who will be our Zoom host. So thank you, Josephine, for keeping this online session running. And before we start, I just want to mention some organizational points. I would say, well, I guess after more than a year of online meetings, you are all familiar with the general information for Zoom and other tools. Nonetheless, there are some rules we kindly ask you to keep in mind. So we would be happy to see you all during the session. So if you don't mind, we ask you to switch your camera on and to turn your microphone off so we all can pay attention to the presentations. And moreover, I like to mention that this session will be recorded for documentation purposes. So in case you do not wish to be seen, we kindly ask you to turn your camera off. Having said all this, we now focus on our 5, I think, alluring presentations. Each of the talks will take no longer than 5 to 10 minutes. And right afterwards, you will have the opportunity to raise questions or discuss the findings or what else. So if you have any question, we invite you to write down your question in the general chat and we will forward them to the speaker after the presentation, right afterwards. So now let's start with our first presentation. We will start with Fenja de Silva-Schmidt from the University of Hamburg with the first talk. Her findings derive from the project Impact Unit, and she will speak about audiences and formats in science communication results from a systematic literature review. Fenja, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Nico. I'm going to share my screen. Hello and welcome also from me. So my name is Fenja de Silva-Schmidt, and today I'm going to present you some results on audiences and formats in science communication from a systematic literature review. First, I'm going to talk a bit about our study. So what did we do? The aim of our study was to summarize, The aim of our story was to summarize current study results on the effects of science communication from different fields of science communication research, since this field is rather fragmented, as, for example, Mike Schäfer already mentioned in his keynote. And to make these results from the different studies useful for science communication practitioners who want to base their work on evidence. And what we did is a systematic literature review based on the Untitled rules. We started with 20 central articles, or sometimes called pearls. Those were articles central in the field of research and included literature analysis and meta-studies. So articles that gave us already an overview of the research literature, but also included perspectives from the practical side. And with those articles, we did the literature research with a technique called pearl growing or citation snowballing. So we looked at, with a first step called backward snowballing, we looked at the list of references of the central articles and looked at every publication contained in there. And so saw if that fit to our criteria and to our aim of our study. And we also did the forward snowballing. So we looked at all articles citing our 20 central articles. With this, we ended up with 237 articles, but we went through all of them again to make sure they really matched our study criteria. And in the end, we had a sample of 162 articles, which we looked at. And then we did a qualitative content analysis with these articles regarding the topics the audiences, the formats, and the effects of science communication found in the studies. So our literature review has a much broader range of results, but the talk in the following is of course limited to the main topic of this session, which is the audiences of science communication. So what did we find out? First, one result regarding the audience is that it's important to distinguish between the intended audience at which the science communication is directed and the audience actually reached, because those are two distinct things that are often looked at separately in the research. Often the intended audience is not really specified in the science communication and also in the research. Even if it is specified, it's specified as the general public, which is in fact not specific. This already hints to the problem that sometimes science communication measures lack focus, but we saw also that over the time of our study, this approach seems to have become a bit less frequent in the current years. If the research is on intended audiences, it often looks at age-specific groups, for example, science communication directed at teenagers or youth or elderly people. It looks at underrepresented audiences. That means audiences that, for example, due to structural inequalities, usually do not take part in science communication activities. Some research specifies on disinterested or disengaged audiences who normally also are not reached with science communication activities. And for some fields, for example, health communication, the intended audience is often patients or persons concerned by a special topic. And another group relevant is students. And on the other hand, the research on audiences that were actually reached focuses on finding different segments in the public, for example, dividing the public by its socio-demographic features, by its interest in science, or by its media use into different groups, and then see, okay, how do these groups react to science communication? What are the different effects? The research on the audiences actually reached often also looks at participants or visitors, which is kind of clear because those are easy to reach. When you have a specific format, then you can do some research on the participants that already took part. And also another focus of this audience research is on specific regional audiences. We found that there are interesting differences by the format of the science communication that is part of the research. And the approach of the audience often differs by the type of the science communication format. This means that for informational formats that mainly aim to provide information on science topics, for example, online newspapers or science museums, they often take a very broad approach, and the intended audience is often unclear. This is what I mentioned in the beginning, the general public. But the effect is that they mostly reach and affect people that are already interested in science. So like the usual public. The dialogic formats that provide information but are also open to feedback from the audience and interact with the audience. For example, science festivals or blogs that really interact with comments. They of course know better who is their audience, because they engage with them in the dialogue, but still in a lot of the research, the audience is very broadly predefined. So it's not like the intended audience is very clear from the beginning. In contrast, participatory formats that require real audience engagement, for example, in citizen conferences or in science cafes, they have often a more specific target audience, for example, defined by a certain region or people affected by a certain topic. And these projects usually have a really well-planned approach. And of course, then the effects of the science communication differ very much between the different approaches. What is the general conclusion regarding the audiences and from our study? I think this quote from the National Academy of Science really sums it up well. substantially more research is needed to determine which approaches are effective for whom, when, and under what conditions. This knowledge should yield general evidence-based principles for how to communicate science effectively and how to adapt science communication to particular audiences and contexts to achieve specific goals. So the general take-home message is it's good to spend more thought on the intended audience and its features. So what is really, who do we target this science communication at, and what are the features? But also it's important to evaluate afterwards who was actually reached by something. And we saw that there's a discrepancy between research on intended audiences on the one hand and audiences reached on the other hand, because those were mostly different studies and the research seems to be really fragmented. It would be more interesting to have more studies that look at both. So at the intended and the audience actually reached. We also found that the disinterested and disengaged audiences are probably mostly not reached from the science communication formats. And the underrepresented or disadvantaged audiences can be seen as a huge potential because they could be reached, but they need specific targets and low thresholds and new ways of appeal. So this could be something that could be a way forward for science communication. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Yes, thank you, Fenja, for this very interesting results. Since some more people just entered the room, if you have any questions, feel free to write them down in the general chat, and then we can forward them to Fenja. Oh yeah, there's one first question. Is your sample representative of all the science communication activities? Maybe you can just answer to that.
I can say that no, it's not representative of all science communication activities, because as you noted in the comment, we were only looking at activities that were studied in scientific literature. And also the studies that we chose were based on those 20 articles that we started from. So we definitely didn't cover everything that is out there, but that was also not the aim of our study to cover everything, but to make up like a summary of, okay, what is known of different effects of science communication. And yes, of course, there could be a bias because some activities of science communication are quite under-researched. For example, we found that formats using humor and in science communication are currently really gaining up speed, but there's very few research on this, and this is often mentioned as a lack of research. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then another question raised by Erika Karlsson. I'm curious about what organizations created the activities. Could you say something about that?
That's really different. For the participatory formats, it was often something by local governments, for example, when they wanted to assess people's opinion on biogenomics or on new energies and so on. So those were quite local activities, but also, for example, universities who start those science cafes and science events, but also science communication activities by single scientists like blogs. So it's very diverse.
Mm-hmm. Then there's another question. What kind of studies were picked? Most journal impact factor of consideration, and how do you deal, or how did you deal with that?
No, we didn't look at impact factors. We started with those 20 core studies and then looked at their sources and also which articles cited those central articles. And then we mostly focused on, okay, what is our research question and does this article tap our research question or not? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's another question. What were common ways to learn more about the audience?
The most common way, I think, is, for example, in science museums, very often, or at science centers, that they have like a survey of people who attended, and then afterwards ask, okay, what do you think, what effect does this have on you? So I think that's also the easiest format to learn more about the audience. Yeah.
And there's another one. Are there activities with high investment but poor reach and outcome ratios? Can you speak to that or talk about that?
Well, as I said, the activity with a very high investment is those participatory formats, because in the beginning you have to really think very hard about, okay, who is my intended audience and what are the features and so on. But this is not a guarantee that this will have the outcome that you intend at the beginning. So the research literature on this says, okay, it's very diverse, and it's like kind of a difficult topic.
Thank you for that. Are there more questions to Fenja? Otherwise, we would continue with our next speaker. Oh yeah, there's one more. Yeah, could you put the link of your research into, or the link of your literature review into the general chat, so all the other participants could read
unfortunately
that,
it's not already published, but it's going to be published later in the summer, or I think at the latest in September. So
okay, so thank you for that. So for all of you, that means just follow the impact unit and you will be informed, I guess. All right, we would now continue with Peeters and Land-Zandstra, both working at Leiden University, and we will now hear something about measuring the impact of science communication, the steps toward a new toolbox. And well, I pass the microphone to you, Wart and Anna, and good luck for your presentation.
Thank you very much. My name is Wart Peeters. I work together with Land-Zandstra and Madelijn Strick on a project that is intended to develop a new toolbox for measuring the impact of science communication. The questions that we try to answer here is, who are we reaching with all the science communication projects and activities in the Netherlands? And what kind of change is occurring? And of course, our main question, how can we measure the impact of science communication? A quick introduction to us. As I said, my name is Wart Peeters, and we work together, or I work together with Professor Land-Zandstra and Professor Madelijn Strick, both professionals and academics within science communication as well as psychology. Now, quickly setting the scene, when we talk about impact, we know that there is some terminology that always needs to be covered, because there are some things that need to be common ground. So when we talk about science communication and what comes out of science communication projects, we can use the word output to refer to direct results, products, or services of these public activities and projects. Further than that is also outcomes, the effect that this output has on a target group, however small or big that target group is. And impact, which often is referred to as the broader impact on society. Now, it is important for us when we are developing toolboxes, instruments, and tools to measure impact of science communication to know what we're talking about when we talk about impact. And to be honest, what happens a lot is we are looking at things that change at different levels for target audiences, society in general. And that is what in our toolbox we're also looking at. So when we talk about measuring impact, we're also actually talking about measuring outcomes. It depends on the different projects and the different activities, what they can produce and what comes out of those projects, what we can start to measure. So what we always say when we say we are measuring impact, we are measuring change. So we are looking at changes, benefits, learning opportunities, and other effects as a result of the work that has been done in these activities and these projects. Now, of course, there are decisions to make when you are developing a toolbox, when you're looking for the right instruments, and when you talk about impact. There is no single approach for any activity that is being set up by researchers, practitioners, or community partners. This means that we have to make the right decisions in order to find the right tools and the right instruments to measure our impact. That is why we have designed a decision tree as a kind of a marked pathway to the right tools and designs, with questions on the goals that you want to measure, the people that you want to include in your measurement, the type of data that you want to collect, etc., etc. Now, the idea behind our toolbox is actually has a really broad focus. We want to cater to all different activities and projects that are happening within the Netherlands. So our toolbox has to be flexible, it has to be usable, and we are heavily supporting creativity within the selection and creation of instruments and tools as well. So our toolbox is actually a toolbox in two parts. We have designed some baseline measurements, some basic questions that can be used in almost any project and any activity. And these questions, they revolve around demographics, about people's science capital, as well as on emotional memory. A couple of concepts that we have borrowed from psychology and from science communication to create a kind of baseline question pack that people can use as they like. Demographics can go or can revolve around age of participants, education level, etc. What is relevant for those projects? Science capital, what kind of affinity and experience do people have with science and science communication? And emotional memory, how did people feel about a certain activity and how intense was that feeling, which gives us information on maybe how people are going to retain the information that they have encountered. Of course, this is not enough. We need precision tools in our toolbox as well. We want to cater towards the goals, the target audiences, and the setup of a project. So we are going to ask them a couple of questions to guide them through to those precision tools that they need. And one of the questions that we ask, and actually the first question that we ask, is which of the communicative goals that you have in your projects do you want to measure the impact of? And we have made the distinction between knowledge, behavior, and awareness. Do we want to inform? Do we want to inspire, or do we want to create new experiences, for instance? What we often see when we work with projects and activities is that they say, well, we want to do all of this. This is all embedded within our project, within our activity. And then we say, that's great, that's fine, but what do we want to measure the impact of? That is a question that people often struggle a little bit with. But of course, this is a decision that we have to make, because we can't measure the impact of everything at the same time. We do have to make it a little bit more focused, in our opinion. Hence, these questions on goals. Of course, the question on goals automatically leads to what kind of data you're going to collect and the data that you're going to use. We make the distinction between trace data. Are you going to track people, for instance, in Twitter feeds, or are you going to work with response data? Of course, this has a major impact on the design, the setup, and also even on the privacy settings of your impact measurement. We let people think about target audiences. Who do we want to include in this impact measurement? Are we mostly looking at children, teenagers, or adults? Of course, you can't use the same tools or the same design of tools for all these different target groups. What works for children does not automatically work for adults. You can't give very lengthy surveys to children because they will not respond to it well. At the same time, when you ask people to, or ask children to draw an image on, for instance, what a professor is to them, what they think about science, is a very nice way of getting information from their points of view. But that, again, might not be a tool or an instrument or a way that works for adults. Of course, we ask additional questions in target audiences on composition, for instance, demographics, education, language proficiency, etc., because that also will influence what kind of tool and what kind of design your measurement can have. Of course, under and overrepresentation of target audiences is also very important to take into account here. Another question that we ask people to think about is, what kind of participation are you envisioning? Do you want people to just provide you with information? Do you want an exchange of ideas? Or do you even want participants to be part of your measurement creatively, think along with you as you are measuring impact. And of course, how many people will participate in the impact measurement during your event or during the activity. If it's between 0 and 25, you might want to opt, for instance, for interviews or focus groups, which is not really an option if you have 100+ people in one single day. So all these questions will lead you towards a set of instruments in our toolbox that you can start to play with and that you can adapt towards the goals, the target audiences, and the design that you need. We have made a subdivision kind of in a 10-story toolbox where we have 10 types of tools. And they all revolve around a very specific thing. For instance, when you look at the first picture, these are tools that revolve around audio-visual observation. The second one is concept analyses, creative techniques, data analysis and tracking, surveys, feedback, focus groups, interviews, personal observation, and voting systems. So this is the 10-story toolbox that we are developing. This is where our tools can be subdivided into. Of course, nice pathway toward that with our decision tree. So our toolbox for impact measurement, we know that the selection and design of tools is dependent on multiple factors. It has to work for a specific activity and for a specific audience. The differences in imagined outcomes and impact, of course, have an effect on the impact measurement as well. So we have to think about that beforehand before we start designing and selecting our instruments. Cutting the branches will make the impact measurement grow stronger. That is what we have learned from research, and that's what we see in practice as well. So a focus in goals, target audiences will get you further in your impact measurement. Goals, target audiences, and participation for us are our key markers that we look at to lead people to the right tools and the right instruments. So clear objectives and creative design is our main goal in our toolbox. That is what we're aiming for. And of course, to help people get to the right place when it comes to measuring the impact of their science communication activities. Thank you very much. If you want to know more about our project, you can scan our QR code. You can always send us emails as well. We are very interested in collaborations and in learning what you guys think about measuring the impact of science communication. And if you have any questions now, I'll be very happy to answer them together with Anna.
Thank you, Wart, for this presentation. There's already one question. What was your reason for deciding to distinguish target groups, e.g. by age or other socio-demographics? Maybe you can talk on that.
Mm-hmm. So the main reason why we made this distinction is because when you think about the right instrument for an impact measurement, it has to be catered towards a specific group. And the things that you do with children are not always the same as the things that you can do with young adults or with adults in general. There is a subdivision within adults as well, because when we, for instance, look at Science Capital, whether you're still in university or whether you're in the job market or whether even you're out of the job market already, also has an impact on, for instance, how you process or how you, what your affinity is with science in general as well. These are very subtle divisions though. So age is a marker that we have chosen as an easy way of distinguishing in target audiences, but of course it is not the only one.
Mm-hmm. But does the toolbox need to be applied after activity or before planning it?
We always recommend taking impact measurement as one of the topics that you have to take into account as you are developing your activity or your project. It is kind of a dialectic process. You are gonna establish what you want to do with your project. And as I said before, the goals and objectives in a project are manifold. We often see that researchers, practitioners want to inform, they want to teach, they want people to take something away from it, but they also want people to be motivated and inspired. And we also want to give them new experiences and maybe even change behavior. So it's always embedded. But when it comes to impact measurement, we do have to make focused decisions. on what we are going to target here. Because as I said before, looking at everything from everyone at the same time will give you a very broad picture, but not necessarily a bunch of data or a picture that is clear or focused enough to get something out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and could you name some high impact activities for children below age of 12? That was another question which was raised.
High impact activities or instruments how do I have to interpret that question?
That's not more detailed here, but let's see. Yeah, maybe we're gonna stick to the next question, and if NSF, if you could concrete your question, then we gonna answer that in the end. In how far is your toolbox evidence-based? That's another question.
So we are collecting a lot of different instruments and tools from around the world. As we know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we do have developed a lot of instruments ourselves as well. These are, of course, tested and validated, and this is a continuous process. We work together with the Dutch government and the Dutch funding agencies for science and science communication as well. Their projects that are approved all have to have this part of impact measurement embedded within them. So we are in this continuous process of gathering data, improving our instruments and improving our approaches as well. So in that sense, it is evidence-based. We are using a lot of data to better our approaches and to get more insights, of course, into the science behind science communication as well.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like the approach looks at understanding the change that physical on-site science education projects might have. Was there actual communication around them, like social media activities that run alongside, were taken into consideration in any way? That's another question.
One of the types of tools that we distinguish are data analysis and tracking and tracing. So we also look at reach of different social media posts, or we look at the uptake of a YouTube video. We provide information and tools for content analyses of social media posts as well. So we do take that into account. It's of course depends on if you want to work with trace data or response data. So if you make the right decisions there, the right indications there, we want to look at trace data, you will automatically be guided towards that kind of tool set or those kind of instruments.
Mm-hmm. There are two more questions we can forward to you. What are your practical experiences with the users? Or do you know who your toolbox users are and what they do with it? That's the first one. And yeah.
I'll answer quickly. We are, of course, in the development phase. We are making a lot of good progress. But as I said, we are including a lot of different stakeholders. We are in contact with a lot of different activities and projects within the Netherlands. But we have also recently branched out outside of the Netherlands as well. So we have master classes running with this toolbox as well, where we are gathering data on how people are using it, what the shortcomings are, if they find it very user-friendly, and if they actually get the results and the outcomes that they want, if they get the right tool or not. So we are in that constant process as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the last question, how does your tool refer to findings from previous talk that the audience are actually not generally specified?
Yeah, we often see this when we talk in the initial stages to people who are designing their projects, who are already doing their projects, and say, well, we want to reach everybody. That is what we want to do. We do now in the questions that we ask, we do not really cater for that, and that might be a little shortcoming now in the design. So for instance, in a science festival, you can have families that come, two parents and a child. How are you going to differentiate between them? What we say now, what our approach now is say, when you have these different target audiences or groups that will come to your activity, you might want to have two different instruments for them. And that then again, for instance, when you have a family, that can be divided depending on age, for instance. That is why we have made that distinction as well, because it's kind of an easy pathway towards differentiation in target audiences. It doesn't mean that you only need one instrument sometimes. And that's now our approach. That's now our vision. As we work with people, as we work with projects, that might change, but we've seen that that does do the trick mostly. Of course, it does require you to have two different instruments or three different instruments, depending on target audiences.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Wart. As you see, that was very interesting for the audience here today. So thank you for being here, sharing your all your ideas, and thank you, Anna, for being here as well. Let's move on to the next presentation. How can inclusive communication leapfrog science uptake? This question will be answered by Durine Odongo. Durine Odongo is from the works for the World Agroforestry, and she will address this question in the next talk. Please.
Thank you very much, Nico. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here this afternoon. Like you've heard, I work for African Women in Agricultural Research and Development, hosted by the World Agroforestry, and we are based in Nairobi, Kenya. And today I want to talk about inclusive communications, and my presentation is really going to build a lot on Fenja's presentation on audiences and target groups, as well as a lot of what Ward was talking about in terms of measuring impact and the toolbox that they are developing for engaging different audiences. And I'm going to present this from the practitioner's point of view. And so a little bit of background about award and what we do. So at Award African Women in Agricultural Research and Development, we work a lot with scientists and institutions. And what we do is we build the capacity of scientists to develop innovations that are impactful, which means that we spend a lot of time supporting these scientists to communicate their innovations or their research to different audiences. So today I'm going to outline what my talk will answer. I'll talk about the background, and then we'll go into unpacking inclusive communications and how communication can actually exclude people rather than, can widen the gap between the people who know and those who don't know, and the opportunities that are there and what we are doing in our organization. So, particularly at this time with the pandemic that we've been experiencing for almost 2 years, there's been such a sharp focus on science, and scientific knowledge has been like a very powerful weapon. And why do we need to invest in science? But also it's also brought to the fore a sharp focus on why it's important for us to engage in timely scientific communication. And this is not new, it's been there for decades. A lot of emphasis on why scientific communication is important, what we need to do. But then it's also clear that we need to be more inclusive, because there's such a diverse audience. And as we've heard from the previous two speakers here, there's nothing as general audience, I mean, there are so many people who have different needs. And so what we found out, and from my time as a researcher and investigating research uptake or science uptake, there was a lot of emphasis, a huge emphasis on publishing in peer-reviewed journals and maybe in conferences, and then most recently on using digital platforms to communicate. But what is emerging is that the scientists are talking to themselves. And I think what we are finding out is that because they're talking to themselves, is there really science uptake? Who are actually taking? So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, as science communicators or as scientists and as people who are working with scientists and enabling them or helping them to communicate their research, what do we want? What is the end goal? Even as we are communicating, do we want people to just know about the science, or do we want actually them to change how they do things? Is it for policymakers to enact evidence-based policies, or is it for farmers, for example? And for me, who is in the agricultural sciences or agricultural research, do we want farmers to change their practices, their farming practices? Yeah, so it's great that we are focusing on peer-reviewed publishing science in peer-reviewed journals, and we're using social media, but it's not enough, because we need to engage the diverse audiences for whom we are working for. And so there's been a shift on increased digital communication, particularly now with COVID, because people have really focused on digital platforms, virtual platforms. But then also there's information overload. So the question is, how are we helping people cut through the noise? But then also, how are we helping those who are not on the digital platforms to get access to this information and this knowledge? And so what we need to do is to intentionally pursue inclusive communications. And so the way we look at inclusive communication is, for us, we need to acknowledge the diversity of our audiences and to pursue equitable opportunities for these audiences to access the communication. So we were paying a lot of attention on digital platforms, and our strategy was focusing a lot on, let's enable the scientists to write blog posts, or let's write blog posts. Let's enable them to present in conferences. Let's use social media a lot. But ultimately, who are we reaching with this information, even as we pursue to improve the visibility of these scientists? And so we are beginning to now pay more attention to the needs and priorities, as well as capabilities of our target audiences. What we are asking ourselves is, and we are encouraging and enabling the scientists to ask, is their communication accessible? So when they write a blog post, and whom do they want this blog post to reach? Or when they say that they're going to avail their scientific findings on digital platforms, whom are they hoping that will access this information? So is it accessible? And then what language are we using? A lot of times we tend to use language that push narratives that would make people shy away. For example, when we tend to portray the scientists as the ones with the knowledge and the farmers, in my context, as the ones who don't know, they tend to just, disengage themselves. Or are we using male gendered words that would then perpetuate exclusion? Are we talking about a policeman, for example, or a chairman of the board, for example? And so the way we structure our communication and the language that we use has a huge potential on eventually determining whether this in communication is inclusive or it's exclusive, and are we locking out some certain members of the population that we are targeting? Are we also taking time to understand the information gaps as science communicators or as scientists who are hoping to get uptake of their science? And so still on conceptualizing inclusive communications, it's really important that we are very intentional in understanding the culture or context within which we work. For example, in my work in Nigeria and with scientists working in Nigeria, particularly scientists who are working on livestock research or livestock science, in northern Nigeria, the culture there is really it's structured in such a way that if you don't understand some of the nuances of the culture, you really cannot penetrate the communities to take up some of the scientific innovations that would help the livestock keepers there improve their productivity. Where are we communicating? Which platforms? Again, I've mentioned the huge emphasis on digital platforms, but who is there? And is the information relatable, and can our audiences actually understand what we're communicating depending on how we are packaging it? And so we see there's a huge potential of communication to exacerbate inequity. For example, by focusing on digital communication, we could very systematically exclude users who are there. Data is showing us that about 55% of the world's population is on social media. But who are they? Who are these 55? Who are these 4.3 billion users? You know, a lot of this you'll find that it's, you know, they're not, for example, in Africa. And so if we use, you know, one blanket approach of saying that the world is going digital and let's go digital, we are missing out on a huge population. For example, in Kenya, 20 million people are using internet, and about 11 million of these are using social media. However, the most preferred channel of information access or sharing is still the face-to-face communication and radio. And this finding is replicated really across most African countries. And so what we are doing is we are empowering scientists and working with them to still pursue the platforms that are most accessible for users. So what are the opportunities for inclusive communication? One, we are supporting and strengthening science communication intermediaries and champions. So these are people like us who are science communicators or scientists with an interest in communication, and investing in science communicators, building their capability to understand what are the nuances, what are the platforms that are readily accessible for the target audiences. Very important, creating relationships with the science intermediaries, science journalists. It's very important that we don't go to them only when you have a big news to announce, but bringing them on board and working with them along as we even pursue these research activities so that they are well informed to avoid misconception or misrepresentation of facts. And very important as well, investing in enhancing the capacity of scientists to appreciate the need for inclusive communications. So at my organization at Award, we are enabling our scientists to appreciate the importance of scientific communication. One, building the individual's capabilities, but also creating an opportunity structure around them so that they're able to improve on the visibility of their research, training them to communicate for different audiences, but then supporting them to document and package their work in different forms. And so more than 70% of our fellows are beginning to really embrace this. And we're seeing a lot of them, we're not saying stop publishing in peer-reviewed articles, yes, publish there, but pursue other avenues to ensure that your intended audience is actually getting the information that you want to communicate. A lot of them are intentionally coming out and saying we want to have opportunities or to create opportunities to communicate with our farmers. And we are taking them out there to the fields to package their communication for the different audiences. Yeah, and so really understanding what is it that you want to communicate? What do you want your audience to do? Do you want them to just understand or to know, or do you want the policymakers? And so the approach that we are taking or that you need to take is very different for each target audience. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have.
Yes, thank you, Durine, for this very interesting talk. There's one question. Why do you think these highcomers are resistant to focus and narrow down to the specific audiences?
Sorry, please say that again.
Why do you think these highcomers are resistant to focus and narrow down to the specific audiences and want to reach everyone? Maybe you can talk on that.
Yeah, okay. I think there's one of the biggest concerns, or maybe one of the bottlenecks, is around resources. Because if you don't have sufficient resources to segment your audiences and tailor your approach according to the different audiences, it's very difficult. So what you tend to do is you go for one blanket approach that you think will reach everyone, and then you tick the box. So there's a big issue around resources, availing sufficient resources that would enable you to segment your audiences according to their needs, where are they located, and tailor your communication for that particular audience.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, there's one. Durine, what are the best practices for reaching audiences of the media? Do you have any experience with that? And and otherwise we can pass this question to Fenja and to Ward as well, if you have any ideas on that.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. From our experience, the media, it's really important to establish relationships with them from the onset and make them our friends. So a lot of times, there's a lot of skepticism in engaging the media because we fear that they might represent the facts or they will water down your science. But if we engage them and have a relationship with them as we go along, it tends to work out very, very well, because then they become interested and following through in your commitments or in your work. So one is creating relationships with them, just getting them informed every step of the way instead of waiting to involve them at the end of the project or at the end of the research, because then they won't have better comprehension of what you're trying to do. So I would say that's what has worked for us. It has worked for me.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. There are two other questions I would like to forward to you. And if there are more questions, I'm sure Durine might answer them in the chat afterwards. First, Durine, can you recommend any tools for identifying and segmenting audiences more than stakeholder analysis? Do you have anything else to share with us?
Wow, I was going to say stakeholder analysis, which we do a lot, but I think one of the other tools that has worked for us, which is still anyway, essentially stakeholder analysis, is getting to understand what are the trends, what are some of the emerging. So really investing in where are the knowledge gaps, where are the knowledge gaps? For example, do we have research in a lot of investment in producing a research variety of a crop variety, say maize, that is resistant to a certain weed, but you still see the uptake is very low. So where is the gap? Once you begin to understand the knowledge gap, so you begin to see whether you need to go directly to the farmers, or do you need to go to the extension workers who don't seem to know, or is it the agronomists who don't understand the packages that have been developed? So, which is still a form of stakeholder analysis. So again, just investing in understanding where are the knowledge gaps, what are the trends, so that you begin to understand which audience you need to focus on.
Mm-hmm. And the last question, and and a comment, knowing how to reach a specific target group, or even to know what group should be a relevant target group, is difficult. How does the support to your research colleagues work? Maybe you can share some insights from that with us, just in a short sentence.
That's a great question. For sure, sometimes it's difficult, but if you start from what is your end goal, like what do you want this? Why are you conducting this research? Why are you working on developing innovations that would help improve soil fertility? Yeah, so if you start from what is your end goal, do you want farmers to have better ways of improving their soil fertility? And then you work backwards. So what we do, and to answer the question in terms of how we are supporting the researchers, we support them to comprehend what inclusive communication is about. So who are the diverse groups of audiences that they're working for? The agricultural value chain, for example, is very diverse. And at some point, maybe your research is working to address the policy options or the policy recommendations. And so that's where you'll focus on. Or maybe your research is working to address, I see your point, Nico, maybe your research is working to help farmers actually take this up. So starting from the end goal and work backwards when you appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Durine. Yeah, perfect.
I'm happy to connect with you on our social media platforms, and we can continue this conversation.
So feel more than invited to get in touch with Durine. We just continue with our next presentation, and I'm happy to introduce Anna Masnou from the Catalan Association of Science Communication. and she will now talk about science communication with gender perspective. You are 10 minutes, Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Can you confirm that you see my screen? Yeah, good. So yeah, hello. Thank you, Nico, for the presentation. It would be lovely to be here with all of you in Berlin. In fact, I love the city, but well, it's also nice to have you here. I'm the head of communication of the Institute of Material Science of Barcelona, which is a material science institute. But now here today, I'm with you representing the Catalan Association of Science Communication, which is a non-profit organization with more than 400 members, which we are professional like scientists, communicators, well, in different journalists also. And in our free time, we do like activities related to science communications, like excellent journalism or projects on science illustration. And we also have a working group on gender. Today I'm here on behalf of this group to show you the activities we do in this area. So yeah, this is my email and my Twitter account. I leave them now because after the talk, if not, I forget them. And now I will show you what I will talk about. Basically, I will present you the group, the gender perspective in science, and then why is it important to visualize women in science, and then some projects that we are carrying out in this field. Our leitmotiv is that women in science haven't had it really easy throughout history. So even Marie Curie, that is the well-known scientist, maybe the most known, in fact, even she said, no, I was taught that the way of progress was neither swift nor easy. So even for her, it was not easy. Imagine for all the other women in science. So our group is from this Catalan Association. It's a meeting space for us. You know, we meet like once a month and we have some ideas about the science related project and of course involving women or gender perspective in general. So we try to come up with ideas and projects to visualize the work of women scientists and not to be known by the general public. Here is a picture of some of us. In fact, and we did this t-shirt that you can see, the black one, that is of one of the activities that we do. So it's like we are more than 15 people in the group now. And yeah, so you can find scientists, communicators, disseminators that we join together our efforts to carry out different activities. The objective, as you can see here, is to leverage women visibility in science and technology, as well as in research-related activities, such as communication, dissemination, and outreach, and also to promote inclusive science in a broad field, like all diversity. So we want to make women in these fields known, especially in Catalonia. That's where we are based on. So our communication is mainly in Catalan, so that young people get to know the scientists also that are working among them, that maybe their parents or friends or their neighbors. So why is it important to give visibility to women? So we don't want any more like Rosalind Franklin's to happen. Like, I mean, so you know that she was, in fact, she had a great role in the discovery of DNA structure, but she was never recognized. So that's what we want to avoid. No? So we want to give credit and recognition to all the women's work and research. So we want that when you ask students, draw a scientist, you can draw a women scientist. This is a typical exercise done. A few years ago, usually kids draw, when you ask them to draw a scientist, they draw a man with, like Einstein. But it's also good to do activities so that when they draw a scientist, they can draw a woman. And also, here is also a quote from Sally Ride. She said, "For whatever reason, I didn't succumb to the stereotype that science wasn't for girls. I got encouragement from my parents. I never ran into a teacher or a counselor who told me that science was for boys. A lot of my friends did." So we want this for kids, so to never let them see that science is not for them, so that science is for everyone. Some of our projects that I want to show you. So we have, well, here are only the titles, but I pass it, so I explain them to you more in detail. So this is maybe our first project, in fact, and the biggest one now is an exhibition of women scientists working in Catalonia in different areas, in all science-related areas. And we have built like 24 panels with with their like photograph and biography. And it's an itinerant exhibition, so it's free and upon request. It travels around the territory. And it's very good because where it goes, we also organize like talks about science-related field with gender perspective, and we involve the scientists in that area where the exhibition is. For example, it has been in different research centers. Here is like the locations where it has been in 2020 and 21, and we have more scheduled locations. So as you can see, it has traveled all around the territory. And it's also available online, because in fact, we started it when the pandemic started last year. So we decided to also do the online version. So all the panels you can download them and print them. And we know of some schools that have printed them and put it in their classrooms. We also do some Wikipedia workshops because, well, the idea behind it is that when you know a name of somebody, what you do is put it in Google, entry of Wikipedia. So our idea is to create more women scientists in Wikipedia, so that when you put the name on Google, you can click it and you can know more of this person. So it's a way of visualizing women in science. So we made different workshops, and we gave tools to the participants, like to show them how Wikipedia work and how can they so create and generate more biographies of women scientists. And well, we created around 25, and we've also improved some of the existing ones until now, but it's an ongoing project. This is a very nice project too. It's called Scientific Art, which brings together science and art. And what we do is we paint, well, not us, but we hire professional painters to paint like historical Catalan scientists in schools, like for example this one. And so then we go to the schools and give some talks about the scientists. Usually it's a scientist that is related to the school in some way. Maybe he's from the town, or she went to that school, or I don't know, or she knew it. So it's also a way for us not to make visible our history in women scientists, that they are not very well known. So for example, Elena Maceras was the first woman enrolled in medicine in Barcelona, or Maria Assumpció Català was the first PhD in mathematics in Barcelona. Currently, we have funding for 5 more paintings. It's a project that the Barcelona Council gave us in this case. We also participate in the European Researchers' Night by encouraging women scientists to present activities and talks and workshops. Like, for example, one of the scientists of the exhibition presented a talk in batteries, which is the research field. And well, from last year, it was all virtual too, so all the talks are in YouTube and you can find them there. And we also organize a lot of roundtables and courses, seminars, especially around 11F, which is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. So here are just some examples of these talks and things. And this is the last project we did now, that was to encourage also Catalan haikus, which are like science-related haikus, which is this Japanese poetry. Well, it was a contest in social networks, and it was really good because then people also get to know some women scientists. Finally, well, there are brilliant women out there working in science. We would like to showcase and disseminate their work to become also role models, so young people can see that, that they can become scientists and also know the history and get some more reference. And organize activities around that, and all ideas and collaborations are welcome. So if any one of you want to contact us, maybe I hope that this project also can inspire you maybe for some ideas to apply in your area or your community. So let's make women in science more visible, and if you want some links, I can pass them to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this lovely presentation. We would have time for some questions if there are some. Otherwise, maybe you could share the link of the exhibition in the general chat once more.
Yeah, sure. I will put well, I'll stop sharing. Wait.
And Anna, there's one question. I'm interested to know whether did your group measure the impact of your work on the community? Maybe you can answer that.
No, I know that I see that this is very academic, no, to measure impact and audiences and all this. For now, we haven't planned to study the impact. The impact we see is that every time we see that, like, we have like more schools interested, they contact us, and there's more people in the group, in the association, but we don't have like a toolbox or anything like that to quantify it. But yeah, it would be great. Well, as I told you, this is like in our free time. It's like we're all scientists and communicators, but we have our other jobs. But yeah, it would be great to involve more people and to quantify it, really.
Mm-hmm. And how did this group of yours come together first? Where did you meet, and how did it involve?
The association has already 30 years old, so we started in 1990. And well, as I told you, we have different fields of different projects. In fact, there is a group on environmental science. There's another group of as I told you, science, journalism. And then, but lately, since the 11F, like I think it was in 2015 that this day was for women and girls in science. We started to think about all the women in science things, that to give it more visibility and all this, and to make science more inclusive and more gender related. And I don't know, I think it was like 2 years ago, we decided to organize some activities around 11F, and that's how the group like spontaneously appeared. And then we sent an email to all our associates and members and asking them who wanted to be part of the group. In the beginning, we met like physically. During this year, we meet through Zoom meetings, and we carry out the projects like in distance.
All right, one last question, and since we are a bit behind our time schedule, I would ask you to answer it shortly. Do you also work on the gender data gap, or do you cooperate with organizations that do so?
The gender data gap. What do you mean by gender data gap exactly?
This question was raised by one person. Maybe you can concrete your question, and Anna, you would be able to answer the question via the general chat.
So thank you all of you, and
all right.
Have a nice conference.
Thank you again, Anna. So having started with the findings from our impact unit, in the first presentation, we will now have the opportunity to gain even more insights in the project with our last presentation. And I'm very happy to introduce my colleague Ricarda Ziegler from Wissenschaft und Dialog. She will now speak about what are we trying to achieve, a reflective look at the goals of science communication.
Thanks, Nico. Thanks, everyone, for that interesting talk so far. I hope you all got some brain power and some minutes left to maybe kind of like follow my invitation to reflect together on goals of science communication. That's what we have been doing at the Impact Unit, which is a project by Wissenschaft im Dialog, which is funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And we are working towards more impact-oriented and towards more meaningful science communication in Germany. And we are also working on a toolbox and evaluations tools like the colleagues in the Netherlands. We are doing kind of networking stuff. That's why I'm here today, but we are also doing some analysis and research on science communication here in Germany. I think one of the challenges which occurred to us when we first started to work in the Impact Unit on questions of impact and evaluation in science communication is that we see that goals and objectives in science communication are seldomly clear identified and defined in science communication in its practice, and there are also not too many, and at least not one kind of like approach for talking about goals and objectives in science communication research either. So that was basically where we started our work on those questions. And we then kind of like firstly come across some literature and some work in the field of strategic communication, where we kind of like think it's important to take this distinction between goals and objective, with goals being more something like abstract visions of what a project wants to achieve in the broader context, also in a societal context, and to distinguish those from concrete objectives in science communications, which are more kind of like rather specific information about what you actually want to achieve in a project, and which can be quantitatively or qualitatively defined. And ideally, when you kind of like conduct a project in science communication, your objectives and fulfilling your objective would also contribute to reaching your goals in science communication. And we then use this distinction and also elaborated a bit more to come up with our, I would say, maybe working typology of goals and objectives. So this is all work in progress, and I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts and discussing it later. And so we also saw that kind of like when analyzing how in research and how in practice people talk about goals and objectives in science communication on a project level, on the level of objective, they distinguish between describing the form of the communication. So they say, okay, I want to do science communication and I want to kind of like inform people, transmit information. There are other ways kind of like that people want to initiate a dialogue between science and the public, or they want to actually allow for participation of the public in science and research. And on the other hand, we see, apart from those descriptions of objectives as describing the form of science communication, objective describing what's the effect, what's the difference this science communication is trying to make. And here we can also distinguish between having an influence on what we call cognitive attitudes, which is kind of like the knowledge and the skills within the public, within your target audiences, etc., that you can try to have an effect on evaluative attitudes, that it's kind of like the opinions people have, for example, on a specific technology, or the way they trust scientists. And of course, you can also try to influence the behavioral attentions or even the behavior of people. And so this is how we differentiate different objectives with which we can describe our science communication activities. And ideally, when setting up a project, these objectives would then contribute for you to reach your goals, which are kind of like on a more broader context. And therefore, we can also distinguish between goals kind of which describe a benefit for the society, that you want to do science communication to do something in the public interest. But of course, science communication can and often does also kind of like have a benefit for science and research, being it for the whole scientific system, being it for different institutions, or being it for an individual scientist, for example, that he or she gets data in a citizen science project and therefore can do his or her work. So this is our proposal, kind of like for inviting everyone to be more precise and distinguish more clearly when talking about goals and objectives in science communication. And we also ourselves kind of like when working on this typology, use this to do a pilot study with this based on this typology of strategic science communication goals and objectives in Germany. So what we did, we analyzed kind of like the papers and the policy papers and the and kind of like the information major central institutions in German science communication are providing, and we analyzed kind of like the documents they are sharing about their vision for science communication, about how they want to do science communication based on this typology. And we did this with a qualitative content analysis and kind of like had a coding frame which were used by two colleagues here, and we kind of like coded a lot of different aspects in these documents, but I'm going to focus now on what we find out about goals and objectives in those documents, which are relevant for strategic science communication in Germany. And you can see here that most of the parts and most of the citations in these documents refer to science communication providing a benefit for the society as a whole. So it's about doing science communication in the public interest. And for the other categories, we see that a lot of these kind of like policy papers on science communication in Germany focus very much on science communication offering a dialogue between science and the public. And when we come to the kind of like objectives dimension, we see here that the focus is very much on influencing cognitive attitudes, like, for example, raising the knowledge, increasing the knowledge of the people. We see here, which we think is also very interesting, that we, on this kind of like policy level, we do not see much mentioning of science communication influencing behavioral intentions or actual behavior of people. I think this might have changed a bit. We finished the analysis in April 2020, so I think this might have might look different today after 1.5 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, also in Germany. And what with these also interesting, that kind of like it's a less focus, just small kind of like just a small number of mentions for science communication actually benefiting individual scientists or scientific institutions. So it's more in the broader context of science communication benefiting society or science and research generally. And why we think this kind of like typology or more structured way, also different possibilities exist here to talk about goals and objectives in science communication, is that we can learn about what's going on in our field. For example, here, one way to do so is that we not only analyzed kind of like the strategic policy documents, which you can see on the left side here, but we also analyzed evaluation reports of science communication projects in the German-speaking countries. And we see here that the results, even though you can't compare them directly, but they give you a hint that the goals and objectives against which science communication is evaluated in practice looks very different what is kind of like formulated on a policy level. So we see here that often science communication in reality is evaluating against the aim of, does it provide information, does it transmit information to people, and this is not what actually is the top priority on a strategic level, though. The same is also a bit true when we look at kind of like how science communication is trying to influence attitudes of people. We see here again that on the strategic level, we have a strong focus on having an effect on the cognitive attitudes of the public, of participants. But when we look again at the practical side here, you see that it's more kind of like balanced, but also science communication in practice being evaluated against the aims of, does it have an effect on the evaluative attitudes or even the cognitive attitudes, the behavioral intentions and the behavior of people. So we think that a topology like ours, or generally more structured approach to reflecting and talking about goals and objectives in science communications, allow for a better understanding of those goals and objectives shared by different stakeholders and actors. It, like I just did, kind of like helps us to identify similarities and differences in goals and objectives by those different stakeholders or also by different institutions. And we hope to contribute with our work and with kind of like the topology which I just presented, to have a more structured and informed debate about the principles and values of science communication and the understanding generally of science communication in its relation to society. And hopefully this will help us all together in the future to do science communication and research more systematically and more structured, but also kind of like in practice to contribute to meaningful evaluation against the right goals and objectives, so to say, and generally kind of like to together critically reflect on the work we are doing in science communication practice. And this is work I have just presented, which is also kind of like majorly responsible. My colleague Liliann, she's also majorly responsible for this work. So thank you to her as well. She unfortunately can't be here today, but I will try to kind of like and answer your questions to the best as I can, and looking forward to your ideas and thoughts and on our ideas. Thanks.
Thank you, Ricarda. There's already a first question. Why do you think there is such a difference between policy level vision and SciComm reality?
I think kind of like one conclusion or one explanation can be that, of course, institutions do not always kind of like put out in those documents all they are doing. So I think it's reasonable to assume that sometimes you kind of like when you publish something like a policy paper or the president is giving a speech and talking about the things, that it's not that you don't tell the whole story. It's also a bit kind of like that you maybe refer to trends in science communication. I think these questions of dialogue and participation is also just like topics which are catchy and trendy, maybe, so to say. So I think this can to some extent explain this mismatch a bit, so to say. But I would also say that I think there's also a need to better align those things. I think if we use kind of like those insights from our work we're doing a little bit at the interface of research and practice, but also the information which are provided by researchers in science communication, if we try to feed this information more to the strategic level, also there can be maybe more maybe better discussions about what actually is realistic for science communication. I think if you put it in a policy paper, you can kind of like have these big visions, etc. But if you do it on a practical level, you have to be very kind of like clear and sensible about kind of what difference can you actually make? Is this realistic with the resources you are having? So it's also something I think we need to work better to also kind of like on a strategic level and be realistic and use the knowledge we have to say, okay, that's something science communication can achieve, but maybe some other things we can't achieve, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And concerning your work, have you actually already published a paper in English, or are you planning to do so?
The whole report is only available in German, but there is an English executive summary. So it's basically a longer version of all the slides I presented and all the other details. And there is an executive summary available in English on what I just presented. It's available via impactunit.de. So there is some English information available here as well.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you can just put the link right now in the general chat for the last
I will try to do
2
it
or 3
parallel.
minutes. All right, are there any other questions to Ricarda? No. All right, we are already at the end of our time anyway, so I really like to say thank you for all of your questions, your comments, and most of all for the insights we got, the presentations we heard. So thank you all. The Future of Science conference now continues after a short break. And there are some other panel discussions, workshops, sessions going on, I think at 5:30, but don't stick to me. I'm not quite sure. I think 5:30. I hope you enjoy the further program and make most of it today and tomorrow. And I would like to say thank you to all of you. So see you in any other rooms, maybe later on. Yeah, and goodbye.